Welcome to DeFi by Design, where we talk all things blockchain and cryptocurrency while striving to educate, empower, and enrich.
It's your boy Andy, and welcome back to the DeFi Slate YouTube channel. Smash the like button on this video, that really helps us out, and sit back and enjoy the content. Thank you very much.
What is going on, DeFi Slate fam? Welcome back to the DeFi Slate YouTube channel with Nico from Tenderize. Me. We are going to talk about liquid staking in this podcast. We'll go through the current staking environment. Obviously, Ethereum is transitioning to proof of stake, and we'll talk about what that means for the Ethereum blockchain, and we'll get into what proof of stake means as a conceptual blockchain architecture, and how blockchains are currently putting them in practice. Proof of stake is obviously economically secured. So these validators are putting up collateral to secure the network in their validator node. And through this economic program of slashing, they're able to cut out bad actors and prevent malicious takeovers of the network. And we'll talk a bit about the censorship that's happening in ETH now. So I will pass it over to Nico and let him introduce himself from Tenderize Me and what is liquid staking?
Yeah, nice to meet you, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So my name is Nico. I'm the founder of Tenderize. Like we said, we do liquid staking for Web3 infrastructure. Before founding Tenderize, I was a protocol engineer at LivePeer for nearly 3 years, where I worked on their staking and everything surrounding that. And then from that experience, saw some need for maybe tokenizing my own LPT, saw the need and heard the need from some other community members that wanted to do the same. And that basically got turned into its own protocol over time after a couple of hackathons, getting some iterations on like an initial team, on some feedback, and hence Tenderize was born out of that.
Awesome. Yeah. And the current environment, I think the best kind of jumping off point is what we've been hearing about a lot, and is in the news currently, is this transition to proof of stake on the Ethereum blockchain. And I'm curious how T tokens, which are the liquid staking derivatives on Tenderize, how are these kind of related to the collateral that's actually staked in the node? The validator node has these tokens locked up to help secure the network. Are T tokens kind of like, are they representing the associated asset that's actually in the node, or is there some sort of like hypothecation that takes place where it's like a call option, or kind of like a redeem, like a ticket to redeem the collateral that's in the node?
Yeah, so the basic gist of liquid staking is that someone who wants to run a validator, he locks up a stake into a contract and helps secure the network. And the T tokens or liquid stake tokenized assets, they represent that underlying stake in that protocol. So if a validator earns staking rewards for performing valuable services to the network, your T token balance will also increase as the node operator earns more tokens. But it could also decrease if a node operator behaves or validator behaves maliciously and gets slashed. So it's inherently tied to what is staked for a node operator or a validator on a network, plus the stake of its delegators stake that other participants that don't want to necessarily run their own validator would delegate towards a validator. ETH doesn't have this, and E2 will also not have this, but other networks have this, often have this notion of delegation of stake as well. So it's a combination of people that choose a node operator to stake to get a portion of their rewards, but also the node operator themselves.
Got it. Yeah, I think we saw that in Cosmos quite a bit, where there was kind of like professional stakers and it was common to delegate an individual could delegate their stake to one of these staking hubs, and when a stake is delegated, what's really going on there? Are they delegating like the blocks that are put together, and kind of the hub is choosing the blocks that are put into the chain, and then if you delegate to that node operator, then you just kind of go along with their vote and kind of act in the same way?
Yeah, pretty much. It's just really picking, I believe this validator or node operator will do a good job on the network, and I'm willing to economically back that decision or that vote with my own tokens, and in return get a portion of the revenue of that validator or node operator in return. If you do a good job by picking good nodes, then you make more than if you would pick bad nodes. So there's a responsibility to do kind of a little bit of curation that way. But it's just saying, hey, I economically put my skin in the game that I trust this validator to do a good job, and I get a little piece of the rewards in return. That's the basic gist of it.
Got it. What have you seen in terms of the other proof of stake layer ones that are out there now? Are they a platform for like experimentation of other proof of stake networks? Do you see these other proof of stake networks, not mainnet Ethereum, which will get to proof of stake eventually? Do you see these other networks as kind of like an experimentation field for what ETH is intending to do?
Good question. Maybe initially, like a few years ago, that would have been the case, but I think proof of stake and delegated proof of stake and the academic research around that has like really grown since, like, let's say 2015, 2016. Before that, there was definitely an experimental phase. I forgot like what the first proof of stake coin was, but that had some issues, like the nothing at stake problem, which is now widely described in literature. So there was definitely an experimental phase, like before, and maybe even before Ethereum, or before Ethereum even was talking about moving to proof of stake. I think it's definitely an interesting sandbox, an interesting real world. Maybe experiments is not the right word here, because we just said that they really aren't that, but some really interesting things that are running in the wild that we can observe as the Ethereum community of what works and what doesn't work. There have been a couple in the past that have come and gone, like for example, EOS a couple of years ago had this really radical approach to proof of stake, whereby they had a select committee, and there were a couple of different approaches, and from that stance, it was definitely an experiment. But I think currently the chains that are currently live have really settled on a paradigm that there's pretty much consensus over, not on all fronts, but on some of the most integral parts of the system, of like, you need to have slashing, for example, or you need to have like an unbonding period or a waiting period to get your stake back. Those sort of things are like generally accepted these days.
Cool. Yeah, the different variations of these proof of stake networks have started to kind of take on more specific approaches. Have you seen any one proof of stake network that catches your eye that's like, they have an economically secure design compared to something like EOS, which failed to, provide economic security for its users?
For me, with my background, the most interesting distinction was kind of around aligning incentives in these networks. So for a layer one or like a blockchain protocol that has proof of stake to secure it, that's really easy, because like the the work you provide on the network is block production, and you get like that's native to the principle of running a blockchain. But if you have, let's say, a work protocol like LivePeer or the Graph, whereby you don't create blocks and you don't process transactions, but you basically provide your computational capacity for someone else to do some work for you, they are also secured by staking. And so if you stake, you get to run a node on these networks. But in those networks, the work you provide isn't necessarily tied to the underlying blockchain and block production. So it becomes much harder to align incentives in those networks and with like purely staking. And that's, I think, where most of the interesting things can still happen. Because in proof of stake, like the incentives are already pretty much aligned. You have the block production, but in those other networks, it's much harder to do so, to align those incentives.
And is that only a reason of the just less capital there is to work with?
No, it's not necessarily that there's less capital. I think it's very much that they are hard technical problems to solve. And most of it comes down to like verification of work that's being done. In like a blockchain, it's really easy. Everyone agrees on the blocks that are getting produced. But when I, for example, encode a piece of video or this podcast for you, you also need to be able to verify that somehow independently and like in a trustless and decentralized way. But that becomes much harder to do so. And because of that, it's much harder to align incentives in these protocols, because you can't pay out a reward with a piece of work that is being delivered. You need to check the piece of work first. But if you can't do that, like within a few milliseconds of the work being delivered, like you would check a block that you get propagated, then that becomes like much harder to do so. So it's much of a technical problem around verification. How do you verify work, and then how do you reward that? Yeah.
Got it. And as far as now taking one step into kind of like the liquid staking derivative world, where the incentives, are there in the actual validators, and the validators are propagating blocks and attesting to the longest chain, and now those validators are earning some capital, or they're getting slashed if they're acting, kind of out of order. But let's say they're earning capital. Now, the T token is representative of kind of like one, one piece of that validator node that's earning capital. Is the T token earning the capital and then kind of reinvesting it right into another validator and compounding, or are kind of like these validator rewards paid directly to the T token holders in the native token?
So it is a combination of both when you do liquid staking, right? I think one of the things liquid staking protocols do is, one, you compound any of the rewards that you would get that are not automatically compounded, because you want to encapsulate all of the revenue generated by that protocol into your T token, into your tokenized asset. And then because the stake is tokenized, you actually get access to those resources that are now automatically compounding as well. So it's a bit of both worlds.
Cool. And are you guys similar to Lido in that sense, or does Lido kind of have a different formula for paying out the liquid stakers?
No, I think our model currently is similar to Lido when we're talking about T tokens, for example, versus staked ETH. Where we do differ is, I think, in how well in the assets that we support. Like we at Tenderize, we don't really support ETH staking at the moment, but other networks. But the other main thing where we differ is in our approach, how we select validators or node operators to where stake is allocated towards. All liquid staking protocols that currently exist, they act pretty much as a pool or as an aggregator, where I as a user come in with my ETH, I deposit it in, let's say, Lido or Stakewise or whatever, and that stake gets distributed or staked. Well, the stake in Lido gets staked towards many different validators on the network. I think they currently have like 19 or 20, and they have a sign-up list whereby node operators can sign up, and then they can get added through governance proposal to receive ETH staking. For us, we take a little bit of a different approach there. We currently also have liquid staking pools, if you want to call them that, whereby funds that you deposit are allocated to one or more node operators. Currently, it's one. That's what we initially launched with. But we have since expanded that idea that instead of stake coming in, going to a lot of different node operators and being allocated there, we are of the idea that that should be entirely open and neutral. So for us, the idea is that every node operator or validator on a network should be able to have its own tokenized, flavored sort of staked assets. So if you have a node operator like Figment on a network, you would have TLPT Figment and TLPT Block Daemon, for example. Because the need that we've identified recently, and that I've also seen myself as a node operator, is that I, as a node operator, would like to be able to collateralize my own stake or hedge my own stake position, which is, as a node operator, not possible if you go through something like Lido. Because one, if I go through something like Lido and the stake is split towards, let's say, 10 different validators, then my stake that I would put in as a validator is also split amongst those 10. But that's not really something you want to do as a validator, because in a lot of these networks, E2 not being the case here, but others they are, work allocation is like stake weighted pretty often. So it's your prime resource of revenue potential is your stake. The more stake you have, the more revenue potential you have. So it doesn't really make sense to go sharing this with other node operators on a network. Obviously, some cooperation is healthy, but competition is also very healthy. And so we believe that each node operator should be able to get utility from liquid staking that that regular token holders are currently getting from something like staked ETH, and really expand that to anyone. So yeah, instead of a pool, we want to have each node have its own derivative, and then anyone can really build a pool on top of that. Let's say I want to build a pool of different TLPT node operators. I can easily do that by holding various amounts of those specific flavored validator tokens. So that's where we kind of differ from Lido in our vision and how we are approaching liquid staking going forward.
Yeah. Do you expect there to be a heavy push of education on who's operating nodes, and kind of going into the censorship, resistance and kind of censorship at the protocol level conversation? The node operators right now are kind of split. Some of them are saying they'll censor transactions and only include those which are kind of legal, in a sense, where like the ones that they aren't approving could have interacted with sanctioned Ethereum address and blocking transactions that are associated with that address censors Ethereum, and they're talking about doing this kind of at the validator level or they're talking about doing this at a few levels, right? One, just kind of eliminating it at the protocol level. And I've heard about soft censorship and then kind of hard censorship where it creates the possibility of a 51% attack. But kind of putting those aside and talking about the censorship that could occur at the validator level, do you expect to see a bit more education on who the individual is delegating to? And it sounds like in T tokens, user is actually selecting not just the currency that they want to stake in, but also the actual validator who their stake is delegated to. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty much the same process if you were to go to, like, let's say the live peer protocol explorer right now. You'd also have to pick a validator. The only difference is with Tenderize, you get a tokenized version of that in return that you can use anywhere. And coming back to your question, I do think there's a lot more increased efforts going on in like education, but also creating tools to be able to see what good validators are. And I know, for example, people are working on reputation for validators based on metrics that people on a network find consensus over and what's important to them. For example, on LivePeer, that would be content of the video you encode and decode, and also the latency in which you're able to return videos back to the source. And it's actually been a lot of my work at LivePeer is to surface some of this data and make it more accessible towards the community to be able to identify who is performing well and who is performing poorly. And based on those metrics, like, people would be able to make better informed decisions on, for example, delegating their stake towards a good validator. So I think there's definitely increased efforts going on in that. And I know, for example, in LivePeer, they recently had a big update whereby they not only try to surface what a good validator or a good node operator rather is on their network, but also where good profitable opportunities might lie. It might not always be with the biggest delegator. Smaller delegators or smaller node operators that you delegate to might actually be more profitable than some of the institutional ones. So yeah, there is a lot of work going on in the community to surface more data on validators and node operators and allow people to make more informed decisions.
And do you suggest validators or kind of give like certain statistics of like, okay, this validator, it has like 95% uptime, or has a block propagation rate of 95% plus. Like, are you giving the user any recommendations that might steer them in the right direction of which validator to choose? And yeah, that's kind of my first question. And then I'm also curious, kind of what separates a good validator from a bad validator.
Yeah, so there's definitely things we would like to do in the next version of the product when this feature becomes available, that you can pick your own validator to surface like what is a good one or what might be a good profitable opportunity. Because one of the things we really want to avoid is centralization of stake. So one of the things we've been thinking of is, hey, for example, showing in our dashboard, hey, there's this smaller node operator. It doesn't really have a lot of delegations, but it seems to have good performance statistics and good profitability. Maybe you should consider delegating towards that node instead of this big institutional one that you were planning on delegating to. So those are things that we can definitely do on the client side to surface a lot of that. And my hope is that as Tenderize grows, the community grows as well, and also has third-party tools and dashboards available that can help people, or APIs even available that can help people. Maybe things like on-chain reputation even going forward that could help make informed decisions.
Yeah, and there's kind of this idea that Ethereum 2.0 and liquid staking derivatives unlock this interest rate market where ETH actually has like kind of a risk-free rate now, or at least some sort of interest rate that's based on the activity and the usage of the platform. And liquid staking derivatives could provide a liquid ability to trade on the interest rate. And now there is a lot of like fixed rate platforms and variable rate platforms where someone can arbitrage those interest rates. I'm curious, kind of like how liquid is liquid staking? Can arbitrage occur at the protocol level, and can arbitrage occur like cross chain if there's a validator with a certain rate on one token, and then another validator with another rate on maybe that same token, and there's arbitrage opportunities on that rate between the same token, and then maybe there's a realm where like validators can, like, these liquid validator tokens are available to trade kind of like cross chain, where like you can trade the TLP token of one network with a TLP token of another network, and we kind of get into this economy of productive assets where like you choose the underlying asset that you're staked in, like whichever network you choose, and all the time those tokens are generating validator rewards as income. Is that kind of like how it works right now, or how it might work in the future, or is there kind of like another path that you see liquid staking going down?
Good question. I think there's definitely like a whole range of use cases that are still to be explored with liquid stake assets. One could definitely be markets for various interest rates and like having arbitrage around that. I think the base would be like one of the most interesting ones to me for personally would be auto repayable loans, whereby you have this maybe not fixed percentage income stream, but you have this collateral put for a loan, and your revenue stream basically pays back the loan by itself without you having to pay back the collateral. I think there's definitely a whole lot of use cases that can sprout from this like that. And it will definitely need things like efficient markets, like market makers that do arbitrage in case something is trading cross-chain, or arbitraging different interest rates, especially when it comes to turning these things into like a fixed income yield product, for example. But even like the most important one we've seen is probably like we've seen recently with Stake ETH and ETH pool on Curve, is that it got imbalanced. So one of the most important ways for arbitrage and efficient markets for these assets to occur is being able to unstake actually. Because what could like bring the current STETH ETH thing Curve pool back to peg is like you would buy up the stake ETH from market and be able to unstake it, and then you have the ETH again. And the only real risk there is the time value of money while you are unstaking the ETH, and obviously also the market risk during that unstaking period. And those are things that aren't currently available for staked ETH, which I think is definitely withholding a little bit on the liquidity it has or the market efficiency it has. Which isn't great if you want to build use cases on top of it, like lending or interest generating products or whatever, anything that like can be liquidated based on a price point, basically. But with other networks, and once obviously E2 rolls around and in 2023 and we are able to unstake, then this kind of resolve itself. And I think that's when we'll see a lot of new things pop up for staked ETH and other assets as well when the market gets a little bit more efficient.
Got it. And do you, what's your take on like the institutional staking meme? Like, it is that kind of also waiting on withdrawals?
What do you mean by the institutional staking meme?
Yeah, I guess right now a lot there's kind of professional staking groups that are out there, and this kind of wave of institutional capital into Ethereum and blockchain applications as a whole, that's starting. It doesn't quite seem like the level of decentralization as maybe like running like even like Bitcoin. It seems like at least on these other layer one networks, there's only the validator set isn't very decentralized, and it's some professional staking groups and then other individuals that are pooling their stake into a kind of centralized organization or entity which represents those individuals. And the institutional kind of staking meme, I guess, is that even the staking groups that are out there right now are kind of professional groups, but there's not very many of them. And I'm curious if you think there is kind of like a dam that is on those groups right now to prevent kind of like the floodgates, from really opening and letting more people through. Do you think the lack of withdrawals kind of plays a prominent role, or is there something else kind of holding up the general masses from staking?
Good question. What I experienced myself in life here is that a lot of these institutional players, they're really good at being early, but they're not necessarily good at operating a good, valuable service. So we've seen this in live peer, whereby initially a lot of the nodes were run by these institutional staking providers. But as demand started coming onto the network, we saw them actually underperform tremendously compared to some of like the home node operators that we were seeing. Like I was running a node from my home, and it outperformed some of these institutional stakers because on live peer you need to run GPUs to be able to handle video efficiently, and they weren't really doing that. They were operating from cloud centers mostly. So I do think there is a possibility whereby if you, or rather, like there is a possibility to outpace these institutional providers as smaller node operators. That's a first thing. But it is a hard challenge because one of the feedback we've seen recurrently in live peer was like, yeah, but they're already so big. How do I compete with them? And so getting people to that stage of believing that they can actually compete with these institutional providers is really important, and being able to prove that. That's what we did in live peer, and what we currently see is that most of the node operators on live peer, they're not institutional operators. There's still some there, but it's really the minority. And I think once we can prove this for other networks as well, like for example, for ETH staking, when we can prove like, hey, you can stake from your home with like a home connection and 32 ETH instead of like 3,200 ETH, let's say, you can make relatively the same amount of income or even more income than an institutional node operator. I think that's when more people will definitely be more interested in becoming this indie node operator themselves. I think the other thing is, and this, I think this gets really dicey real quick because there's people that have different visions on this. But what's the ultimate vision of who do we expect to be a validator or a node operator? Do we expect everyone to run a validator from his own home? Like everyone has like, I don't know, like a TV box for television in their home? is that what we want to go to, or are we going towards a world whereby a lot of different businesses that need like settlement, for example, I don't know, like your local grocery chain or whatever, where they become actually a validator for a smaller community of people, but they carry out those responsibilities indirectly. And the validator step becomes like a bigger set of everyone that kind of settles larger values on the network, somewhat to speak. I think those are also two differences in vision of like where we're going. And the answer to your question also kind of depends on that, I think. But I wouldn't say institutional node operators are bad or anything. I think they have really, they have been the ones bootstrapping a lot of these networks early and allowing people to come in after them and basically outperform them if you do a good job. So there is room for improving on them and outperforming them, and thus growing your own operation yourself. And I think what is important there is make sure you create a value-added service for the network and not just another node operator or another validator that does the same thing. So what I did with LivePeer to gain a competitive advantage was, yeah, obviously I was part of the core team, but outside of that, I created the first, and it's still the only fully automated video encoding and decoding pool, similar to a Bitcoin mining pool, where you just connect your GPU rig to our servers and you're able to encode video on LivePeer and get paid ETH in return. That's what I created for LivePeer, and that ended up being a great value-added service that people wanted to use, and hence that attracted more delegations towards the node got more work, and then you are kind of in a hockey stick growth there from that point on. And I think more people should realize that they are able to do this as well, and compete with these institutions, basically as a home operator.
Yeah, that's really cool. Could you explain the journey you went on from LivePeer and setting up that node to like what did that teach you about staking that you guys are now kind of exploring in Tenderize?
What it taught me about staking, I guess a lot of what I learned there is around how incentives on a network should be aligned, what we talked about earlier. I think the most important thing I learned there was actually how do you bootstrap these networks? Because you always have like a bit of a chicken and an egg problem of, well, if there's no demand, how do you get supply on board? And if there is no supply, how do you get demand on board? These are kind of hard things to solve. And like what I learned there was really building a grassroots community of people that see an opportunity and that needs some fostering and some care. So what I did at LivePeer was I was like, okay, how can we get more node operators onto the network? And like, how profitable is it really? So the thing I did was I ordered a cheap rig online for like, I think I paid less than $2,200 for a rig with 2 GPUs. And I let it run for like a month or two, and it was the second or third top earner on the network within like 2 weeks. And that kind of proved the thesis that, hey, it's possible to start a node from scratch on Live to actually make money. Created a blog post being really transparent towards the community of like, hey, I created this node. This was my setup. This was exactly how much I made. You can do this too, but be aware if like there's more people joining, your rewards will likely diminish a little bit. But that's kind of what got a lot of people going. And then from that point on, it was a lot of support, answering concerns, and really bootstrapping a community that way with the whole LivePeer team. But yeah, that's basically the approach we took. Is like, let's just prove something, And if people like it, they can join as well. How that translates to Tenderize, I'm not exactly sure, but we've definitely learned a lot there when it comes to, well, not only what are good node operators, but can small node operators also be good for a network, or can they also be good delegation targets in terms of profitability? And I think the answer we've learned there was definitely yes, and that institutional providers aren't the holy grail or the only option on those platforms.
Yeah, and decentralization and kind of like, that the level of institutional activity might depend on the network and the community and what they want to solve, and kind of those basic principles could guide a network when they're setting up validators. Do they want to take the more individualized approach, or are they kind of on a different place? Are they in a different place on that scalability trilemma, where they're okay with taking some decentralization trade-offs, for decentralization and to increase, speed or cost or something like that. And those are decisions that are up to kind of the network itself and the community to decide, as a consensus. And like speaking to kind of communities, all over the blockchain ecosystem, what advice do you have for a network or a community that's kind of just starting out and maybe doesn't have too many nodes, or is just kind of like defining these baseline principles? What do you suggest for a community that's looking to launch a validator set?
Yeah, my biggest advice would be to keep your keep the cost of starting on a validator as low as possible. Keep that entry barrier low, to whereby it doesn't even become a concern for anyone. I think once you start doing things early on in your life cycle as a protocol or a network, like you need to have this minimum amount of stake or something, that already poses a high barrier of entry to some people. Whereby I might have, well, we've seen this in live here over and over, people that had mining farms from mining Bitcoin or mining ETH, and they had the GPUs, but acquiring the LPT tokens for them to run a node at times was sometimes a big concern. That's why we always had to stress in live here, like the cost of entry is actually really low. It's like, now it's a bit higher because there's like a dynamic mechanic attached to it. But like a year ago or something, it was like literally maybe $5 or something you needed a stake to bootstrap that. But for other networks like the Graph, whereby you need 100K GRT to run an indexer, that becomes a big barrier of entry, because GRT over the last year or so was trading above 50 cents or above $1. So that then becomes like $50,000 or $100,000 just for the stake to bootstrap your node, let alone like acquiring the hardware or the bandwidth you need to run it. So I would say, yeah, keep the entry costs as low as possible is the biggest thing. And make it really clear to your community as well that on the hardware side, as long as there is no demand, you probably don't need as much compute as if there were demand. So they can get away with like a little bit less hardware early on, but have to scale that up as the network grows. Because I think what a lot of projects do is they list the hardware requirements to run a node, and it's based on like, if we had X block propagation, or if like this amount of video was flowing through the live peer network. But is that really needed at like the point of inception? And like, yeah, communicate really well about what the cost of entry is. Try to keep it as low as possible. That's my best advice for protocols trying to bootstrap kind of similar networks.
Got it. And it's interesting to see kind of like the level at which a staker might enter the system, like like 32 ETH. What do you agree with their decision to kind of like set it at 32 ETH? Do you think they should have? I guess it's the Ethereum core devs that are kind of making this decision. Do you think they should have set it lower, kind of based on like bootstrapping the initial proof of stake network?
Good question. The initial idea was that you could run both a 32 ETH validator or a 322 ETH validator. But for the 320 ETH validator, you had to pull 10 times the amount of compute. That was the initial idea, so that your stake would need to scale with the compute you can have. Because if you had a lot of stake and you would stake that, but not enough compute to back it up, you would lose out. But if you would have like too much compute and not enough stake, you would also lose out. So that was the idea, that it would scale. But I think we're stuck with the 32 ETH increments right now. I'm not really a big fan of that, because one, you need chunks of 32 ETH, and if you have more than 32 ETH, you need to spin up an additional node. But like, what if your node that you already run, what if you just could increase the computational capacity of that it like would perform the same as if you would like run two nodes? And also like having to split the capital, having to manage two different validators, that becomes like a process that needs automated DevOps really quickly, and then you get back to institutional providers or like bigger players in the market. So I don't really fully agree with the 32 ETH decision. And I like, there are other networks that tried something similar, like Pocket Network, which is like the decentralized Infura. They used to have, you needed like increments of 15,000 pockets to run a validator, but they have now passed a proposal whereby they have removed that, and you can run whatever amount of stake you want on your validator higher than 15,000, or in increments of 15,000. So you could do 60,000, for example, and receive potentially 4x the amount of work from a validator that only has 15,000 staked. So pretty much like what E2 kind of intended with the 32 ETH chunks. Yeah, I think we're seeing actually networks move away from that paradigm. Not much evidence to back that, except for Pocket Network and maybe some others that I'm not aware of. But yeah, generally not a fan of the concept. I would have rather seen just regular delegation and staking. But it is what it is at this point. So
yeah, it does seem that kind of like there have been a lot of experiments, in the past of these layer one networks setting up proof of stake networks, and they're still a work in progress. Like, they're still not perfect in the sense that they're not as decentralized or not as robust a validator set as these networks might intend, but they're getting there. And it's kind of like it's a learning process every step of the way, where what works for one network doesn't necessarily work for another network, and the network kind of has to learn that on its own. And I think ETH is really learning that, and they're probably learning a lot from other networks as well. And I'm curious if you've seen any of. I'm thinking of ETH here, but I'm curious if you've seen other networks achieve the critical velocity where, like, they kind of have enough stake. Like, at a certain point, does it become kind of redundant or just kind of excessive? Is having 80% of the network staked, is that so much more secure than like 30 to 50%? Like, is there a level where if it crosses that, like, it's kind of like just it's secure enough, and then anything past that is just kind of like
yeah,
cherry on top?
good question, because we also had this arbitrary mechanism in LivePeer whereby we decided if more than 50% of the tokens in circulation are staked, inflation will go down, otherwise it will go up to incentivize more people to stake. Is that 50% like the holy grail number? No, that was arbitrarily set during network genesis. It worked kind of for us. Other networks, like you said, have chosen different parameters. So I think this is pretty much, a lot of this is arbitrary, and I don't think it really matters that much. I would even say that there can also be like too much staked if you don't, like if you also need to provide a secondary market for the token, and that needs liquidity, but everything is staked and you don't have like a liquid market. So I definitely think there's like a balance between the two, because like if you don't have a liquid market, then it becomes harder for outsiders to acquire the stake and then start a new service themselves, which hurts decentralization, because like you can't get new entrants in because, again, cost of entry is too high because high slippage on the liquidity pools. I think then it becomes problematic. Obviously, when there's too little stake, that's also not good. So I think maybe a better way to look at it is like, not in terms of nominal amount, how much percent of the supply is staked, but how much dollar value is staked versus how much dollar value is being transacted or settled over on a network, rather than try and compare it in like nominal token amounts. But even then, who says like a mechanic of like, should X% of tokens be staked? Is that like a good mechanic to have? Those things are very much debatable still, yeah.
Interesting. We'll see how the Beacon chain, I think they're at like maybe 5%, maybe like 8% of stake. I think they saw like a good amount of a stake enter the Beacon chain and start to set up validator nodes with the 32 ETH. And yeah, I think, like projections seem to be on track as far as like the relative amount that's staked to how much volume is going through the network at, any given time. I know there's been, plenty of hiccups along the way with other networks like Harmony, Solana, just, the proof of stake networks that have seen some issues and they've had some trouble just like securing the chain, maybe due to like not enough decentralization. And it seems like ETH has achieved kind of a two-pronged approach of decentralization as well as enough capital in each of those nodes to make a significant economic impact on securing the network. And as we kind of look to wrap up, what are your overall expectations for the trajectory of like proof of stake networks? And just any closing thoughts you got, man?
Yeah, I think like we kicked off this kind of call, there will still definitely be evolutions in the mechanics of these protocols. I think some of the things we have set in stone already, like slashing and unbonding periods and whatever, but other things like how much of a network's token should be staked, like how much security should be a good baseline, things like that are still things that we are determining as a community. And as like, for example, Ethereum or Cosmos grows as a project as well, like how much security do they need? I think it's definitely a very interesting design space going forward, especially with not only layer ones adopting proof of stake mechanisms, but also work or utility tokens like LivePeer and the Graph, and what that means for them to have like these staking mechanisms and what that means for incentives and mechanics on their networks. And then, definitely building on top of that, like what we are doing with Tenderize, building on top of those proof of stake networks with liquid staking and what use cases that can unlock and how that can like even help decentralization and help people compete with some of these larger institutional node operators that have been early but not necessarily create the most value for a network.
Got it. Awesome. It was a pleasure having you on, Nico. We'll drop the link to Tenderize, and everyone can go get their T tokens on these existing proof of stake networks. And we're all hoping on a successful merge. So, Nico, it was a pleasure. Where can our audience find you? And is Twitter the best way to get in contact?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I think my username is iamnico.eth, but I'm not sure what my handle is. Tenderize, you can find it at tenderize.me. We support LPT, GRT, audio, and Polygon at the moment for liquid staking. You can also hop into our Discord, follow us there, and be part of our mission to decentralize Web3 through liquid staking and creating more opportunities for stakeholders in these networks.
Awesome. Cheers, Nico.
Cheers. Great talking to you. See ya.
Likewise, man.